schools. But unless we have the sharing, the mechanisms, the platforms, nothing is going to happen. Thank you very much.
Shashi, thank you very much indeed for that. Before you put the microphone down, just one point. You said methods and techniques as used by Cambridge Analytica, for example, are the sorts of things which have already been, I think you said, exposed and outed in your part of the world, which I think is interesting. I'd just like a little bit more on that, because I think from many of our perspectives, certainly from a British perspective, there's been huge naivety on a sort of the non-state level, naivety and maybe idleness about personal information, the importance of data protection. And it sounds as if, A, that's something that you have got over, and B, I just wonder how.
There are a couple of observations I could make, and I don't want to generalize and say that there's an Asian perspective on the privacy of your data. So I'll speak for Singapore. And for Singapore, we have a very well-regarded Personal Data Protection Commission, which some pretty tough laws when it comes to what local SMEs and MNCs can and cannot do when it comes to the use of data. But their remit and their reach, I do not think would have been strong enough to catch Cambridge Analytica, which is obviously transnational. So the second observation I will make is that many people in Singapore, so long as basic safeguards like the PDPCs are put in place, generally are much more accepting when it comes to sharing data, making the data available if the basic background reason can be explained to them. As I said, we're trying to be a smart nation. Government has done a fairly convincing job in Singapore to say that at the back end, government will take your data, but will anonymize it and aggregate it in order to provide you better services. And that's something which is a powerful and compelling argument. And in general, at least in Singapore, we tend to buy that argument. I can't speak for the rest of Asia.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, Ricardo, over to you. Again, if you could give us your position, taking up your seat in Europe, in the heart of Europe, on cyber threats and security.
Thank you so much, David. Dear ministers, friends, and fellows present, let me begin with these words. Dura lex sed lex. Latin. The law is hard, but the law is a law. These words are not to be ignored, no matter which judicial system is practiced. Thus, in short, we have to look at these facts, and the facts only. These are the facts. Our world is in a crisis. Not a crisis of man, but in a crisis of crisis itself. We are witnessing day after day the systematic changes on global scale that threatens our world of peace and stability, democratic values and integrity, and more importantly, our justice in law and its purpose in establishment. These are the facts. During 2014, we held the first African Counterterrorism Summit in London, attended by 136 countries. We warned of the looming threats to the EU. And let me point out, in particular, the need of support to Ukraine. Despite these warnings, many of my disciples in the EU still ignored it and called me a bluff man. Now, once again, we are debating potential and global threats and geostability, in particular threats aimed at Ukraine. Let me say unto you, the combined risk of cyber threats and military from actors including Russia, North Korea and others cannot and must not be undermined. Doing so will be a gross error in the very near future. Don't wait for this to arrive. Act and act now. The critical infrastructure is key to survival in these endless battles. Write this down. We at ECIPS and CYBERPOL are confident that zero-day vulnerability will arrive sooner rather than later. These are the facts. Can I say, do we all want to cry? On 20 December last year, I announced in Belgian Federal Parliament, in a partnership with APEMA and ECIPS, in a press conference. And we confirm the terror funding and Qatar links, proven fact. We have the data. I pointed out Bitcoin pyramid Ponzi scheme. These that funding terror financing involved in cryptocurrency. I once more warn that Ukraine remains at risk as long as Crimea is not in sovereign soil and open to the door of many other economic and security risks. It's therefore that we must forge strong partnerships, economical transparency and judicial reform in our new world of order today. The United Nations resolutions must not be undermined, but more importantly, the rights to accountability in the future of responsibility cannot be dismissed by law. That's the purpose of ECIPS and our interest. Therefore, do not underestimate our mandate of CYBERPOL. I can confirm that CYBERPOL believes a major cyber attack is imminent in the very near future to happen. Risk to critical infrastructure such as nuclear stands at #1 on our list. The growing tensions, therefore, must not be undermined. It needs mitigation. Fueling it is not in anybody's interest. However, we have to focus on rooting out this corruption. At the same, I can confirm that CYBERPOL officially confirmed that more than 8.6 billion records has been breached since 1996, and nobody can escape it. It's unfortunate. If you don't believe me, simply ask a sample and we will gladly provide you the proof of such. These are the facts and the facts of law. Last month I announced during my speech at side event United Nations in partnership with ECOSOC that CYBERPOL will begin full-scale operations within 60 days. 90 days, my apologies. Today is exactly 60 days remaining. I can reaffirm you that within 60 days we will begin full-scale global operations. Dura lex sed lex. Remember these words. This brings me to the topic, how do we hack and crack the lies? Let me say, it's simple indeed. Root out any and all corruption. These are the facts. Corruption is the key to this global epidemic. Failing to react to this global epidemic called corruption undermines the rule of law and undermines your sovereign state and its existence. It's our assessment that the current global climate is predictable and almost has certainly reached a point of no return. We need to question what is our priorities in the EU. Can it be questioned? If our responsibility only rests in Brussels, then we have forgotten why the EU in the first place. Let's strengthen our capacity, capability, cyber command as a whole and get ready, as I believe we have reached a day not to be forgotten in history. A day unlike any other which shall arrive very soon in the near future. Let's for a second focus on the current conflict zones. I recently participated in the Defending Children Victims of Terror at the United Nations, in which I'm part of the investigation team of the ADTV. The UN resolutions are clear and can not be forgotten, but should be enforced by rule of law. My message to those on border conflicts: keep the distance and stop these occupations. Accountability is around the corner. Let's not forget those victims today as we stand here, also in Ukraine. Make no mistake, let's not forget the children victims in the past. I was asked recently, will I run for public office in the EU? The answer is yes. But let me assure you, if I do run for public office, my priority will be to root out the corruption, number one. Mind, heart, and bank, no matter where it is. I leave it up to you to decide if I should. I can only promise you one thing. We need to reshape the face of our perception before it reshapes us. Thank you, honorable ladies and gentlemen. Let's stand together, unified, and be vigilant, and don't forget, we are all together the collective cyber power of CYBERPOL. Thank you.
Ricardo, thank you very much. I'm going to open this up to you for questions as well in just a moment. So yes, I'd like to see how many hands are springing up. We've got quite a bit of interest. So just before I do that, Jeffrey, built on what you've heard there, you laid out some very neat parameters for us at the start. I'm still struck by certain remarks coming from the stage, if you like. Ricardo saying the key is to root out all corruption and painting a sort of Armageddon picture, frankly. You said it's about we've got to learn how to play offense, how to get on the front foot. I just wonder, and Shashi, you can help me here possibly, how does that happen? Because the clear message is that we, whoever we might be, are starting from a very low base compared to whether it's Mr. Putin, as you would perhaps posit, whether it is illegal gangs, drugs trade, cryptocurrency, whatever. How do you get on the front foot? Can anyone give us some help on that? Shashi.
This is probably not the answer you're looking for, but I'll share with you as background that most of my work in the past 10 years has been on violent extremism, radicalization. And there are some experts who are beginning to pick up on the fact that between the fake news, echo chambers, and filter bubbles, and the study of violent extremism and radicalization, there are actually similarities, and there are similar filter bubbles as well. Now, the most useful types of early interventions that I found for the radicalization, jihad, is actually very, very early interventions, what I talked about right at the end of my talk, critical thinking interventions at schools. Everyone's talking about it now. It seems to be almost flavor of the month. But the most interesting pilots I've seen, actually not in Asia, but in Europe, are when you approach the target group almost before they are allowed to fall into the at-risk category. Yeah? Almost before they have been subjected to the barrage of information warfare. The problem is that from the policymaker point of view, and I say this because I used to work in government in Singapore, allowing these kinds of interventions are very, very hard to accept because there's no KPI, key performance indicator, there's no cost-benefit analysis, there's no control group. It's impossible to have one. But at least for radicalization, you've reached a stage where you have to accept things have reached such a serious level that you have to try. And in 15, 20 years down the line, when the group has not been radicalized, they're loyal, successful, serving members of society, that you've had success. So patience is needed on the part of people who make these interventions. Patience is needed on the part of people who assess them as well. Not the answer you were looking for, but I just wanted to give you my preliminary impressions of another field, interventions potentially being tried for hybrid warfare information.
Yeah, no, I'm happy with the answer. The question still vexes me. Jeffrey, I don't know if you want to have a stab at that.
Sure, thank you. I've got it. Well, and therein lies, one of the 312 problems we have. Patience is the answer, and we live in a time that doesn't permit or invite much in the way of patience. We have politicians who pander shamelessly, and yet if they don't, they get tossed out of office very quickly. David, first of all, I would say to context, it's an alarming situation because of the confluence of factors and events that we face today. Now, from an American perspective, it was never easy in the first place. And anytime someone laments to me the deplorable state of American politics under Donald Trump, which one can only acknowledge, gosh, pick a period like the 1960s or 1970s in the United States, the good old days when everything worked. And those were the days of Vietnam and Watergate and racial segregation and desegregation and the assassination of Martin Luther King and the assassination of President Kennedy, those were the good old tranquil, stable days. So the first point is, I would say, is we've known turmoil before. We've known complexity before in the United States and the world. Second thing is, I think you're completely right about patience. As I said, the environment doesn't invite that. But somehow we have to break problems down to manageable bits, manage expectations, and develop short and medium and long-term strategies. I'll give you one. Root out all corruption. I'll give you one, Russia. Well, Russia, as I said, is a great kleptocratic case study which only survives and thrives with the assistance and enabling of us. Western institutions, Western banks, real estate in Western markets like Miami and LA and London. That's not an easy problem to tackle, but that would be a piece that one could begin to confront and produce some results in some period of time.
Okay, thank you. Ricardo.
I think it's rather important to understand the evolution of the definition of corruption, because one of the big problems in the law is how do we define the word corruption? It's one of the few words that's not in the judicial system defined. And that brings a lot of confusion of what is meant by corruption and traditionally is thought the ordinary crime. However, when we look at corruption in a modern world, we have to realize that corruption has taken different forms. We have to understand that the way to mitigate this and to understand this is to look at the world and the type of corruption in traditional systems that often now is surfacing. Bitcoin, for example. Why is this so important? Well, in 2014, when I was the official responsible for Border Patrol, we pointed out the deep risk of the corruption involved in the Bitcoin structure, because it was funding international terror. However, due to political interest, that was suppressed, and we can see the result, what happened in Europe, which most was funded through the structure of cryptocurrencies. Unless we understand how to root and tackle this at the bottom of the corruption and understand the value and the word of corruption itself, we will continue to misinform ourselves. And that's key, that we understand what the word corruption means.
But even if I just say, let's say corrupting influences then, and if
Absolutely.
we look at the Czech Republic would be a good example, but there are many other countries where there has been an infiltration through social media, now ultimately through emails actually, targeting people who want to hear certain things. I mean, this is what I don't understand. How do you overcome those sort of simple challenges when they're so far down the line? People, as we were saying earlier, you know, people who've grown up, Jeff, you were saying, youngsters have grown up with this fast-moving social media digital world. They take it and they move on. They read it, they go. They don't spend 3 hours in front of a painting. It's very. How do you turn that around? I appreciate you mentioned education.
Shall I?
Yes,
Okay.
if you could, then I'll open it to the floor.
I was particularly, let's point out, for example, the issue on email. You was pointing out, Dave, on email. We now know that 8.6 billion emails has been compromised worldwide. So how relatively is it easy to influence a nation with such data? It's relatively easy when you can use that, because social media is already past tense. It's understanding the risk of current cyber breaches. And once we understand how current cyber breaches plays a major role in changing political views, and how it can influence political views by the data, access to the data, you no longer need access to Facebook. You only need access to the deep web. If you have access to the deep web and you have a copy of 1 billion emails, what can you do with it?
Or the dark web, or whatever we call it. Yeah.
Exactly. And that is where things becomes really fundamentally important, because many of these corruption structures is exploiting the data available in the deep system. And when this data is no longer exploited for criminal activity only, but for political activity. And that is where the real big danger lays, is when people can have access to these type of tools, which is not regulated, and the data is freely available, it should be protected.
Okay, right. I said I'd open it up. We had some questions, gentleman here, and then one at the back, and then one over to the left. You could just let us know who you are and where you're from. Thanks.
I have a question to Jeffrey Gatman as a fellow American, just visiting here. I'm a contributor to Radio Central in Belgium, as well as past contributor to New York Observer, Alternate, Truth Out, and others. I'd like to make a comment and a question to Jeffrey Gatman. The first comment about Trumpism as an American living both in the US and part of the time abroad, including Japan. Trumpism is a failure of the system, as Professor Noam Chomsky characterizes a breakdown of the manufacturing of consent. And the reason that Trump was elected, because basically Trump was an anti-system guy. As a true American, majority of Americans simply do not believe the system works for them, and they simply wanted somebody outside of the system, regardless of its prophecy to self-destruct and create a lot of different political and moral upheaval and so on and so forth. The question to you I have, Mr. Gatman, is as a head of the organization that solved the failure in Iraq, solved the catastrophe in Afghanistan, and also has been a huge proponent of the invasion of Libya, that has some simplicity resulted in enormous chaos around the world. How do you think you, as a head of the organization, have any credibility to attack or confront the Russian threat of the so-called fake news, when your organization yourself has been tainted in the past, not only with the support of the U.S. government political agenda, but also with this, with a variety of different issues in the past? So that's just a question I simply have to you. Comment would be appreciated. Thank you.
There's a direct question for you.
Okay, so I think you're giving me a lot more credit than I deserve for authoring the war in Iraq and authoring the war in Libya and other things. And I'm not sure which organization I led that did those things, but we can talk about that offline during the coffee break. I'd be happy and eager to. To the first point, I think you're right, and I think it helps reveal a big part of the problem for which, David, we don't have any simple short-term answers. So Donald Trump, we can talk forever about why he won the nomination for the Republican Party, the presidency, but he ran as an outsider against the establishment and against the established order. During our primaries, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders together got 45% of the primary vote. People say to me, well, they have nothing in common. Well, one thing they do have in common is neither were affiliated with the two mainstream establishment parties, and both of them ran against the status quo. 45% of primary voters. The second piece that I'd like to mention is Donald Trump didn't come from nowhere. He's not a space alien. So if you find him vulgar, if you find him a bully, if you find him crass and uncurious, he reflects something that's real in our American popular and political culture that didn't happen overnight. And we can dissect that and unpack that for some time. I think what it leads us to is the conclusion, in my view, that a non-insignificant number of Americans are distrustful with Washington, Wall Street, elites, and mainstream media. Whether that's justified or not, that's another matter, but only when Wall Street and Washington, mainstream elites and mainstream media find ways to win back trust and credibility with that part of our democracy are we on the path again to something that's reasonably healthy and stable. And I don't have a formula or trick for that. And it's not one politician or one candidate. We got here through a process. We're going to get out of it through a process as well.
Okay, thank you. I think there are many reasons why we've reached that sort of anti-establishment feeling. Sir, yes, thank you.
Доброго дня. Professor.
I'm Professor Igor Todorov from the Uzhgorod National University. I have a question to all the panelists. As regards countering Russian propaganda, obviously Russia does not share Western values, but they use those values to their advantage very well through Russia Today, through financing partisan and NGO structures like Falanga in Poland or Ubik in Hungary. We see in the West that sometimes some fake representation offices of Donetsk republics get established in the West, that citizens from NATO countries allegedly fight on the side of the occupation forces. But is the West, speaking in general terms, prepared within the framework of law to come up with something workable to counter Russian propaganda and Russian financing within Western world countries? Шаші, я хочу звернутися до вас. Як ви думаєте, ви можете прореагувати на це? Я думаю, що мене можна звільнити, оскільки я не з Заходу, я зі Сходу. Звільнити від відповіді на це питання. Я можу коротко вам сказати. Росія має...
This narrative, they attempt to focus on past historical tradition, legacies, certainly in Donetsk, and they try to overplay, to exaggerate certain weaknesses, points of conflict, let's say the fight against corruption in Ukraine, so on and so forth. I am going to say something where I'm going to comment on Ukraine, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong. My impression, speaking to Ukrainian friends and experts, is that there is a quest or a journey underway to construct an alternative, more credible narrative, which at least partly hinges or depends on the Ukrainian future, which is in Europe. And that's a much more enlightening future, it's a much more positive future. And there, even arguably, and this is my assessment, the Russian state in its disinformation operations may actually have miscalculated. They may have made a mistake because they did not offer something compelling. They were just turning to the past, turning to history. It may well be, I know it's difficult to be too positive or too optimistic at this stage, but it may well be that the Ukrainian counter-narrative is the one which eventually wins out. At least I'm positive based on what I've seen, what I've heard. But in order to do that, you need some, not just governments doing the counter-narrative, you need some slick, high-quality production values. I'm constantly struck by every time I come here to Ukraine, to Kyiv, that government certainly tries, it tries to coordinate, but the most interesting minds who are doing the counter-narrative work are actually those who have spent some considerable time and experience in the private sector. For example, those who have done work at large corporations, repelling or fighting black operations against other economic competitors. These are the very devious minds, and these are the guys who should be brought over to our side in order to construct the most appealing counter-narrative. Because for this generation of digital naturals, digital natives growing up, only that kind of appealing, slick, visual counter-narratives is going to work. And by the way, for radicalization against Islamic State, it's the same thing, same kinds of counter-narratives that you need.
Is that, Jeffrey, what you had in mind when you talked about getting on the front foot, being on the offensive? It's got to be the best advertisers in the business, basically. The slickest PR guys are the ones who are going to start creating the sort of material and messages that could take the initiative.
Well, yes. I just, David, add, however, I don't think this is I don't mean to say you suggested this, but I don't think this is a public relations exercise or a time for Madison Avenue, or this is selling things. And narratives, as I understand them, to be meaningful and sustainable, they have to be rooted in something real and authentic somehow. I mean, this is part of, if I may say, you know far, far, far better than I, but part of the genius of Vladimir Putin is that he taps, maybe Donald Trump too, they tap into things that are not inauthentic. They didn't make them up. Let me give you a quick example. I have a former student of mine at Georgetown who worked for the Peace Corps somewhere in eastern Ukraine, I don't know where. a year before the war began and the intervention was undertaken. He lived in teaching English in a small community of ethnic Russian speakers, and he told me that at the time, when he asked them, what is it like to be an ethnic Russian in Ukraine, and what do you think about Vladimir Putin? He reports to me, no one in his circle of friends, 20-something, cared about anything. They played in a rock band. They said, let's play some music and drink some beer. I don't know, we don't care. He tells me after the annexation of Crimea and after the intervention, the same young 20-something in his circles, they couldn't speak anymore. He said a common question he was asked was, Kurt, why does President Obama support the genocide against the Russians in Ukraine? The genocide against the Russians. Why am I telling that story? Whatever it was that came from the Kremlin, it wasn't manufactured either in outer space. There was something lying dormant there that he smelled and understood how to exploit and manipulate, but it didn't come from nowhere. So all to say, this is not a public relations exercise. Narratives have to be rooted in something authentic. And for our side, and I'm going to say, the side of truth, where we think that there's something called objective truth, we have to work with facts, accuracy, independent verifiability, and reliability. And we have to find narratives that people, ordinary people, care about in a sincere sort of way. This is conference land here. I'm talking about ordinary people. I'm not talking about us conference people.
And that is the massive challenge, isn't it? Because as you say, where do narratives come from? And frankly, history provides most of the best narratives, and overturning that historical narrative is, as Shashi was saying, is perhaps the biggest challenge. Ricardo?
Propaganda is easy. Management of propaganda is not easy. It's how it's managed. And that is important to understand. Making propaganda is a very easy part. The other part we have to understand is a failure of international law in existence. We have an international law, dura lex et lex, which I understand is part of the question, that is practically non-existence. And that's the biggest problem we have currently international. We have the treaties in place. However, none of the treaties is respected or exercised. We have the UN in place. However, none of the UN is in capable hands to manage it. Therefore, we need to understand the reform of the judicial system. Unless we immediately reform the global judicial system, we are in for big problems. And that's a factual thing. It's not only Europe, but it's all the countries as actors that's beginning to get out of the positioning. And that's where the propaganda can be a huge factor in such change. And it's tempering and hampering the change. We need to reform international judicial. Unless we get that done, there's a recipe for disaster.
Okay, thank you very much. I know there were some more hands which went up. There's a gentleman here. And was there another question? Yeah, over there. Yeah, okay. So we'll start over here if we can, and then we'll come over to you, sir.
Добрий день. Мене звати.
Good afternoon. My name is Volodymyr Bondarenko. I'm the director of the Institute for Political Studies. For 4 years, I've been volunteering in the ATO, engaged in forecasting. We managed to forecast election of President Trump, Polish President Angela Merkel, even the beginning of a war, Russia with Ukraine. I have such a question. Dear colleagues, could you tell me whether Ukrainian authorities could preempt information attacks from Russia based on forecasts made by independent think tanks like your organizations, maybe it would make sense for all of us to join our efforts at international level between such organizations which are represented in the Open Ukraine Forum. Thank you.
Because you know they're going to keep coming, but how specifically you could target those? Does anyone have an answer on that? Ricardo, first of all.
Yes, it's right. Well, first of all, cyber attacks, what we have witnessed in the last 2 years, is nothing to what comes. So I'm bringing you the bad news. The good news is that can we prevent this? Can we prevent any form of attacks to sovereign states? And yes, there is methods, but unless the critical infrastructure and the CERT program of the federal states is upgraded, we are going to see these problems get worse. And the first rule would be is not to get the think tanks together, but to understand how critical infrastructure plays a major role in threats, the mitigation of cyber threats, as well as military threats across Europe, and particularly for Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. Do either of you, Shashi, do you want a word on the question?
I would separate the issue of technical cyber attacks, meaning malware, from hybrid warfare and influence operations, informational aggression. On the first, my understanding from the technical people is that some of the most recent technical advances for cyber malware on the defense side is that you can use AI to spot the malicious code as it comes into your system, and in some cases, you can actually let the malware come into your system in a sandbox, if you understand what I mean. In a sandbox, you can study it, you can hope to defend against it, you can understand the aggressor better. This in turn is a sort of arms race, because the very good malware can in turn spot that it is inside a sandbox, it realizes it's been observable, and then it shuts down. So that, I think, is very much the future, as far as I understand it, of cyber malware and defense. Now let's think about this for a second. In a very, very diverse, cosmopolitan place like, let's say, Singapore, which is data rich, which has so many attack vectors, social media penetration, broadband penetration, immigration, can you actually try to sandbox an informational aggression? And I think that's very, very difficult. I would go as far as to say that's very, very difficult in Ukraine as well, not just because of social media penetration, but you also have these cleavages, maybe not as diverse as Singapore, but you do have them. So once you have spotted it, it has already been going on, and as Russian informational doctrine has shown from the pronouncements of the chief of staff, especially Valery Gerasimov, you seed internal oppositions in your adversary long before you actually need it. That's a new wrinkle, a new inflection in what is actually very, very old doctrine, going back to the Bolshevik Revolution, or maybe even before. So my point is, separate out the technical malware attack from informational aggression. There is a point where you can at least try to contain some of the malware if you're good enough, but the informational aggression, very, very difficult.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I know we've got time for certainly one more question, if we could get that there. And then there's I think, hopefully we'll get both questions. Yes, sir.
My name is Hosaka. I'm from Japan. My question is very simple, about the possible division of works between government and civil societies. My observation is that the audience, which is particularly vulnerable to the Kremlin narratives, so that is disinformation, including all kinds of conspiracy theories, they tend to be doubtful, cautious, doubtful of their own government's official information or narratives. So my question is there any, do you see any roles which the civil society maybe stop fakes, as you mentioned? Is there any role that civil society can play to counter disinformation campaign?
Fair question. Jeffrey, I mean, you've made the point about this anti-establishment world we live in and the distrust and skepticism of governments.
So if I understood the question correctly, it's simple as it is hard. There has to be such thing as truth. There has to be in any functioning democracy, or if we wish a country to evolve in a liberal, more democratic way, there has to be information and journalism that's accurate, reliable, fair-minded, working with facts that are in some way independently verifiable. And that's the space of journalism still, and that's the space of civil society. In a world where distrust in elites, in government, in media grows, and where technology often enables that, it's a big, hard fight. But I don't see any other fight worth fighting or any other path to get us there.
Either? Quick remark.
I was going to say the first recourse should be to mainstream well-regarded quality journalism. And I'm sure, David, you're familiar with some of the recent studies which suggest that there's been a sort of movement to these trusted sources. But speaking more from the Singapore experience, I couldn't agree more that civil society will have to play a role, perhaps more difficult in Singapore, where the security discourse, for long historical reasons, has always been top-down. There has been a lot in terms of consulting people to understand their aspirations for healthcare, for retirement. But in countries, many Asian countries, where for security issues it's always been top-down, you have a crisis, you set up a committee, there'll be these permanent secretaries, subcommittees. I'm not sure in the age of informational warfare that's quick or reactive enough. So you need to use civil society and not just mainstream journalism. In Singapore, I would say very, very well-respected bloggers, social media figures who may be influencers themselves, who may be out of the reach of government, who from time to time may even quite often disagree with or be out of favor with government, but they have certain appeal, certain influence with the digital naturals, with the millennials. But again, from the former policymaker point of view, that means you have to let go, and letting go is the hardest thing to do.
Yeah, their influence is massive, though. I think that's recognized. We have got time for one more question. Gentlemen, you were very patient, so thank you.
My name is Mykola Skiba. I'm from Ukrainian Institute for Future. I deal with educational. My observation from last event and from the today discussion is the many countries and global communities in some kind of point of bifurcation. In one way, the limitation of access to social media, limitation how deal with data. In other hand, other way is how equipped or how the armed each individuals, each people in the digital literacy, how it increase skill each people, how deal with cyber security, how deal with information, and balance, as for me, is first way. More and more regulation, but from my opinion, is more valuable way how armed, how equipped each individual. What perspective your speakers see in this way through the Sasha mentioned about the critical thinking in school, but what about the adults? What about special course for adults? What about the cognitive science special maybe course for thinking? Yes, I'd opinion.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Yeah, I mean, that's the point about the arms race. Anyway, regulation is too slow, Shashi. The phrase there that I picked up on was digital literacy, which millennials have in spades in terms of managing digital, but being educated to understand and to see and to spot the, if you like, the fake news is another challenge.
Yeah, we sometimes make the, thank you for your question, the mistake of assuming in this digital enabled age that the solutions, even the counter-narratives, have to be digital. I often like to tell this. I've been involved in de-radicalization studies, extremism for a long time. It's easy to be radicalized online. I've never seen a single person in my life de-radicalized online. I don't think it can happen. You can de-radicalize people, you can take people out of their echo chambers, but it almost always needs at the same time some sort of real-world intervention. I mentioned Singapore government is good at consulting people, they've improved a lot. Sometimes this has unexpected byproduct. You put small groups of Singaporeans in a room, thousands of rooms. I don't like you, I don't know you, but you're Singaporean, different color, different religion. We talk about issues. At the end, I still don't agree with you, but when I leave, I think this person seems reasonable, but his argument is completely different. It doesn't make sense. It's not that you've changed your mind, but you started this very, very important process of critical discourse. This is discourse. This is what we used to have before echo chambers and filter bubbles. We need to bring this back, and that's not online. That's real world.
That's a very good point, perhaps on which to close this session, but discourse as opposed to just statement would make a huge difference, perhaps, in terms of people's perceptions. We're going to bring this to a halt now because the clock has beaten us. There is clearly so much more to discuss here, and the challenge is only ever greater, as Shashi said at the end. Who's ever been de-radicalized online? I mean, that is, if you like, the nub of the challenge ahead of us all. But to our panelists, once again, thank you very much indeed for bringing your expertise to bear on a very complex and tricky subject. Perhaps I could ask you to exit the stage for me, stage left, if you want to come down the steps here, because we're drawing to the close of our first day of the forum. I think you'll agree it's been an intense day. Well, if you're going to take a photo, we'll just get a very quick photo because you probably won't get another opportunity. I'll stay here, but you can take the photo of the panel. And as that photo, no, you get on and do it. I'm just going to talk to my audience for a moment. As that photo is taking place, we're going to